June 29, 1926, Killy, County Offaly, Ireland. A litter of 10 greyhound pups was born at Millbrook House, the home of a quiet country parish priest named Father Martin Brophy. The house sat on the edge of a small rural village in the Irish Midlands, the kind of place where nothing much happened and nobody expected anything remarkable to come from. Father Brophy was a lover of greyhounds, had been his whole life, and he had carefully arranged the mating of his own dam, Née Bach Lay, with a sire named Glorious Event, owned by a man from Portlace. The litter that arrived was healthy enough, 10 pups, strong and well-formed, all except one. The smallest and weakest of the litter was set aside almost immediately. He was underdeveloped, undersized, the kind of pup that most breeders would write off without a second thought. A runt, the one nobody expected anything from. In most kennels, in most circumstances, that would have been the end of the story. But Father Brophy kept him. The little pup was named Mick the Miller, after the odd job man at the vicarage who helped raise him and the rest of the litter, looking after them daily in the yard at Millbrook House, walking them, feeding them, watching over them through the early weeks of their lives. The name was casual, almost an afterthought. Nobody attached any significance to it. The dog was a runt, raised by a priest in a tiny Irish parish, named after the man who swept the floors. There was nothing about any of it that suggested the world was about to change. And then the disease came. Before he ever saw a racetrack, before anyone outside County Offaly had heard of him, Mick was struck down by distemper, a highly contagious viral disease that at the time killed most dogs it touched. He was barely a year old. The infection spread through his body, and by all conventional expectations, that should have been the end of Mick the Miller. Most owners in that situation would have accepted the loss, grieved quietly, and moved on. Father Brophy refused. He brought Mick to a local veterinary surgeon named Arthur Callanan, who treated the young dog slowly and carefully, working against the disease day by day, nursing him back from the brink against every medical expectation. It was a lengthy recovery. There were moments when it seemed futile, but Callanan kept working and Brophy kept believing, and eventually, against the odds, Mick pulled through. The recovery itself became part of the legend. Years later, when people spoke about what made Mick the Miller extraordinary, they often started here, not with his races, not with his records, but with the fact that he had survived it all. The dog who would become the most famous greyhound in the world had nearly died in a field in rural Ireland before he ever ran a competitive race. Some animals, it turned out, are simply not built to quit. When Mick finally recovered and began to move at full speed, something became obvious to anyone watching. This dog was built differently from everything around him. His stride was long and effortless, covering ground at a pace that seemed almost mechanical in its consistency. He didn't appear to be working hard. He appeared to be doing something that came to him as naturally as breathing. Father Brophy's trainer, Mick Horan, watched the young greyhound work and came away from those sessions with a clear conviction. He told Father Brophy directly, this was a real racing machine. Not a good dog, not a promising dog, something beyond that entirely. Mick raced in Ireland for the first time in April 1928 at Shelbourne Park in Dublin, winning on debut in the Punchdown Stakes. He raced 5 more times that same year, winning 4 of them and equaling the world record for 500 meters along the way. He won the Spring Cup Final at Harold's Cross Stadium and the National Cup Final at Shelbourne Park. He reached the Easter Cup Final at Shelbourne Park, establishing himself as the best greyhound in the country. He went on to win 15 of his first 20 races in Ireland, and word was spreading through racing circles with increasing urgency. There was a dog in Offaly, a small dog raised by a country priest in a village nobody had heard of, and he was doing things on a track that other greyhounds simply could not match. By the time 1929 arrived, trainer Mick Horan had seen enough. He told Father Brophy the time had come to take this dog across the Irish Sea to England and enter him in the English Greyhound Derby at White City Stadium in London. The Derby was the biggest race in the sport, the most prestigious, the most attended, the most covered by the press. It was the race every owner dreamed of winning, and Horan believed with complete confidence that Mick the Miller could win it. Nobody in England knew who he was. He arrived at one of the grandest sporting venues in Britain as a total unknown, an Irish dog from a tiny village, trained in open fields, never having seen anything like the scale or atmosphere of White City. He was listed at odds of 25 to 1. No one in the London racing establishment was paying particular attention to him. Then he ran his trial. In a solo run before the Derby on July 25, 1929, Mick broke the track record at White City. Not matched it, broke it. In a single pass down the strip, this Irish unknown had gone faster than any dog had ever gone on that track. The racing world stopped and stared. His odds immediately collapsed from 25 to 1 all the way to 4 to 7 favorite. In the space of a single trial run, the dog who had arrived as a complete nobody was now the expected winner of the biggest greyhound race in the world.
And if you made it this far, hit subscribe, because there are 100 more stories like this one waiting to be told.
Father Brophy was immediately surrounded by people wanting to buy Mick. The demand was instant and overwhelming. He made the decision to sell him right there on the terraced steps of the stadium, conducting an impromptu auction on the spot in front of the crowd that had gathered to watch the trial. Mick sold for 800 guineas, more than the cost of buying a house in the nearby neighborhood of Shepherd's Bush at the time. The sale was recorded in the evening papers that same day. It was front-page news across London. Part of the deal that Father Brophy negotiated was that he would still receive the trophy and prize money if Mick won the Derby final. It was an unusual arrangement, but Brophy had not traveled all this way to walk away empty-handed from a dog he had raised from birth, nursed through near death, and brought across an ocean on the word of a trainer's instinct. The first round of the Derby confirmed everything the trial had suggested. Mick pulled away down the back straight and beat his opponent by 8 lengths, posting a time of 29.98 seconds, a new world record over that distance. He had become the first
greyhound in history to run 525 yards in under 30 seconds. A barrier that had seemed almost unreachable had been broken in the opening round of the Derby by a dog from County Offaly who had been listed at 25 to 1 a week earlier. By the evening of the final, 40,000 spectators had packed into White City Stadium. The atmosphere was unlike anything most of them had experienced at a greyhound meeting. This Irish dog had captured the imagination of London in the space of a few days, and the public had turned out in force to see whether the story was real. Mick wore the black jacket in Trap 4. When the lures started moving and the traps opened, he broke cleanly, found the inside rail, and came through the field to win by 3 lengths. When Father Brophy collected the 700-pound prize check and the silver trophy that night, the crowd carried him around the stadium on a lap of honor, tens of thousands of people cheering a country priest from the Irish Midlands who had believed in a runt no one else wanted. Word reached Calais late that night. The village lit bonfires. People gathered in the streets. The small dog born at the bottom of the litter had just won the greatest prize in greyhound racing, and the whole county of Offaly celebrated like it had never celebrated before. But Mick the Miller was only getting started. The remainder of 1929 was a procession of victories. He won again at West Ham Stadium. He finished the year with 26 wins from 32 races, an extraordinary rate of success against the strongest competition in the sport. Crowds at every venue he appeared at grew larger. Newspapers began running regular features. Racing fans who had never attended a greyhound meeting in their lives started showing up at tracks just to see this dog run. There was something about watching Mick that people found almost hypnotic, the effortlessness of it, the way he seemed to operate at a different level than everything around him, without strain, without desperation, just a relentless, smooth, devastating pace that other greyhounds couldn't live with. He returned to defend his title in 1930, and this time he went through the entire Derby campaign without losing a single race. Back-to-back English Greyhound Derby titles. He was the first greyhound in history to achieve it, and the record would not be equaled for more than 40 years. He was at the absolute peak of his powers and showing no signs of decline. That same year, he won the Cesarewitch at West Ham Stadium and the Welsh Greyhound Derby at Cardiff's Sloper Road Stadium, setting yet another world record in the process, 29.55 seconds over 525 yards, a time that would stand as the world record for years. Over the course of that extraordinary summer, he set 4 new world records in just 40 days. At his peak, across the 1930 season, he constructed a winning streak of 19 consecutive races, breaking world records 4 times during the run. The sporting press ran out of superlatives. Newspaper editors who had been running headlines calling him the Wonder Dog quietly retired the phrase. They replaced it with a single word printed in bold across the back pages of papers all over Britain: invincible. He finished the 1930 season with 20 wins from 23 races. More people were attending greyhound meetings in Britain than football matches. The sport had gone from a niche working-class pastime to a national obsession, and the man, or rather the dog, most responsible for that transformation was a brindle greyhound from County Offaly who had been the runt of his litter and had nearly died of distemper before his first birthday. Then, the injury came. On August 23, 1930, during the Laurels race at Wimbledon Stadium, Mick tore a muscle in his shoulder mid-race. He pulled up. The 19-race winning streak that had made him a national icon was over. The crowd at Wimbledon fell quiet, in the way crowds go quiet when they sense something has gone wrong with an athlete they love. Mick was taken off the track and examined. The injury was serious enough to end his season entirely. He didn't race again for months, resting through the autumn and winter while the British racing public anxiously followed every update on his condition. He came back. That's the thing about Mick the Miller. He always came back. In February 1931, Mick returned to racing at Wimbledon, only to suffer a torn dew claw in a trial run almost immediately, forcing yet another delay to his comeback. Injury had followed injury. He was 5 years old now, an age at which most racing greyhounds had long since been retired to stud, their competitive days considered finished. There were quiet conversations in the racing press about whether Mick was simply too old to continue, whether the great champion had run his last meaningful race, whether the damage accumulating in his aging body was too much to overcome. He finally resumed competitive racing in March 1931, winning the Spring Cup at Wembley and equaling the track record in the final. The doubters went quiet. The performances showed that whatever Mick had lost to injury and age, he had not lost the essential quality that made him Mick the Miller, the ability to find a gear when the race demanded it, to absorb pressure from other dogs and respond with something that looked almost contemptuous in its authority. His target was the 1931 English Greyhound Derby, a 3rd successive title, something no greyhound had ever done, and something many racing historians considered close to impossible. The Derby was contested by the finest dogs in the country, young dogs in the prime of their speed and strength. Mick would be going into it as the oldest serious contender the event had ever seen. The road to the final was harder this time than anything he had faced before. He suffered a shock defeat in the early rounds, beaten by a dog called Mick's Fancy in the 11th heat, the kind of result that sent ripples of disbelief in the betting markets and the press. Then he was beaten again, and this time not narrowly. A powerful new Irish import named Ryland R., a greyhound who weighed over 80 pounds, extraordinarily heavy for a racing dog, with the brute strength to match his size, beat Mick by 5 lengths in the second round. It was the most heavily he had been beaten in years. The racing public began to wonder whether the great champion's story was finally coming to its close. For the first time in approximately 25 races, Mick entered the semifinal not as an odds-on favorite. That in itself felt like an ending of something. He had been the odds-on favorite for so long, in so many races, that seeing his odds drift felt almost disorienting to the people who had followed him. Ryland R. and Mick met again in the semifinal on June
20th. Coming out of the first turn,
Mick found himself fifth, bumped wide by the pack, with Ryland R. pulling away from the field and opening up what appeared at one point to be a 15-length lead. It looked hopeless. Then something happened that no one who watched it ever forgot. Mick began moving, not with the desperate, scrabbling effort of a dog chasing a lost cause, but with the same smooth, relentless surge that had won him 19 races in a row. He overhauled dog after dog, moving through the field with calm, devastating purpose, until only Ryland R. remained ahead of him. As they crossed the line together, Ryland R. held on to win, but only by half a length. The Evening News ran the headline the next morning: "Mick has never run a better race." He had qualified for the Derby final through pure, stubborn greatness. He had been 15 lengths down and still almost won. The old dog from Offaly was not finished yet. 70,000 people packed into White City Stadium for the 1931 Derby final on June 27th. It was the largest crowd the stadium had ever held for a greyhound meeting, a gathering of people who understood they were watching something historic, either the greatest triumph in the history of the sport or the final act of the greatest career it had ever seen. Mick and Ryland R. were joint favorites at 13-8, reflecting the semi-final performance that had reminded everyone what Mick was still capable of. The final was chaotic from the opening of the traps. Ryland R. broke fast and seized an early lead. Mick found himself at the back of the field coming out of the first bend, in the worst position he could have been in. The crowd watched as the old champion was swallowed by the pack. And then the final bend arrived. In the closing stages, Ryland R. lunged sideways at a dog called Seldom Lad running next to him. The two dogs collided and swung wide. The field fractured. In the confusion, Mick the Miller found a line on the inside rail. He drove through the gap with everything he had and crossed the finish line first, winning by a head. The crowd erupted, 70,000 people on their feet. Mick's owner, a woman named Fiddy Kempton, who had purchased the dog after his time with Father Brophy, broke down into tears at the trackside. "Mick has won," she cried. "My darling Mick has won." Then the klaxon sounded. The stewards had called a no race. Under the rules in force at the time, if a greyhound fought and ruined the result of a race, a rerun would be ordered. Ryland R. was judged to have attacked Seldom Lad on the final bend, causing the interference that had opened the gap Mick had run through. Ryland R. was disqualified and excluded from the rerun, but the result was wiped from the record. The trophy would not go to Mick the Miller. There would have to be another race. Fiddy Kempton was furious. She refused at first to allow Mick to run the rerun, standing at the trackside in tears, insisting that her dog had already won the Derby and that asking him to run again 30 minutes later was a cruelty and an injustice. The directors of the Greyhound Racing Association, who were present that evening, understood what was at stake for the sport. Two favorites refusing to run in the rerun of the Derby final would have been a catastrophe for greyhound racing's reputation. They persuaded Kempton to relent. Mick would run again. He had nothing left. The rerun was held less than an hour after the first race. Mick the Miller, 5 years old, exhausted from the most physically and emotionally demanding race of his career, lined up in the traps one more time. His old legs, as his trainer Sidney Orton would later put it, simply could not carry him a second time at the pace the Derby required. He faded through the race and finished fourth. A dog named Seldom Lad, purchased originally for £5 by his owners, took the trophy. When those owners stepped forward to accept the Derby Cup from the presentation platform, 70,000 people booed them. Not because Seldom Lad had done anything wrong, but because everyone in that stadium knew what they had witnessed, and none of them believed the right dog was holding the trophy. The controversy made Mick the Miller more famous than any victory could have. The story spread beyond the racing press and into the mainstream newspapers, onto the front pages, into the conversation of people who had never attended a greyhound meeting in their lives. The Greyhound Mirror and Gazette wrote that greyhound racing had already produced a favorite as idolized as any horse, cinema star, footballer, or boxer in history. Articles about Mick appeared in publications in Germany, Australia, and the United States. He had become something that transcended the sport that had made him, a figure of public sentiment, a symbol of injustice and resilience, a dog that the whole country felt they owned a share of. And remarkably still, he was not done racing. He returned to competition later that year and produced what many who watched it considered the single greatest race of his entire career. In October 1931, at 5 years old, 3 or 4 years past the age at which most greyhounds were considered finished, Mick the Miller entered the St. Leger Stakes in Wembley Stadium, then known as the Empire Stadium. He had already beaten his main rival for the title, Seldom Lad, on 3 separate occasions during the qualifying rounds. When the final came, 40,000 people filled the stands to watch. Mick ran with a clarity and power that seemed to belong to a younger dog entirely. He won the race, cleanly and decisively, in front of one of the largest crowds Wembley had ever assembled for a greyhound event. The race was later described by those who covered it as the greatest ever staged at that stadium. He was the oldest greyhound in history to ever win the St. Leger. He still holds that record today. His retirement was announced in December 1931, 5.5 years after he had been born, the smallest pup in a litter that nobody expected much from. When the final accounting was done, his career record read 51 wins from 68 races, 6 world records set, 7 track records broken, 5 major classic titles won, including 2 English Greyhound Derbies, the Cesarezowicz, the Welsh Derby, and the St. Leger. His 19-race winning streak was a world record that would stand for more than 40 years. He was never outside the top 2 finishers in 62 of his 68 career starts. He earned nearly £10,000 in prize money across his career, the equivalent of close to £500,000 in today's money. He had won every title the sport had to offer, survived near-fatal illness, overcome serious injury, come back from retirement twice, and finished his career by winning a classic race at an age when most greyhounds were years into their retirement. At stud in Norfolk following his retirement, Mick the Miller became the most expensive stud dog in Britain. The demand for his offspring was unlike anything the sport had ever seen.
Owners and breeders across Britain and Ireland wanted greyhounds carrying his bloodline, and his progeny went on to win major stakes races and set new performance benchmarks across the breed for a generation after his death. The sport he had transformed was now producing faster, more competitive dogs, in part because of what he had shown was possible. But Mick the Miller's fame had long since stopped being purely about greyhound racing. He had become something larger than the sport. His races had been attended by royalty. He had appeared on BBC television, one of the first dogs ever to do so. He had featured in newsreels that played in cinemas across the country before the main feature. He had been photographed and painted and written about in magazines across 3 continents. The Greyhound Mirror and Gazette had compared him to cinema stars and champion boxers, and in 1934, 3 years after his retirement, he starred in his own feature film, Wild Boy, a movie based directly on his life story, made with the genuine involvement of the great dog himself, appearing alongside the popular comedy duo Flanagan and Allen. The Evening News predicted it would be one of the most popular British films of the year. The only surviving copy is kept today at the British Film Institute. He appeared at the opening of Catford Stadium in 1932 as the guest of honor, paraded before the crowd to thunderous applause, still recognizable to every person in attendance even a year into his retirement. He attended charity events and public appearances across the country.
He posed for photographs with politicians, entertainers, and sporting figures. He was invited everywhere, recognized everywhere, beloved everywhere. During some of the hardest years Britain and Ireland endured during the Great Depression, Mick the Miller had given people something to rally around. Not a human champion, but a dog. A small brindle dog from a small Irish village who had beaten illness and injury and age and the most powerful greyhounds on the continent, who had refused every opportunity to be ordinary, who had kept coming back when every reasonable analysis suggested his story was finished. The British public during those years needed that kind of story. They needed something that reminded them that the smallest one in the room, the runt, the overlooked one, could turn out to be the greatest of all. Mick gave them that. He gave it to them over and over again, on tracks across Britain and Ireland, in race after race, in a career that stretched across 3 extraordinary years and produced moments that people who witnessed them talked about for the rest of their lives. Mick the Miller died on May 6, 1939, just short of his 13th birthday. His owner donated his body to the Natural History Museum in London because the public was genuinely, deeply unwilling to let go of him entirely. His preserved form stood on display in the museum's main hall for decades, visited by generations of people who had never seen him race but knew his story, before being moved to the museum at Tring in Hertfordshire, where it remains on display to this day. A small brindle dog in a glass case, the most famous greyhound who ever lived. In 2011, the people of Killee, County Offaly, erected a life-size bronze statue of Mick on the village green. The sculptor created it to his exact measurements, scaled up slightly to be visible from a distance, and included the scar on his right cheek, the exact scar Mick had carried in life. The statue was unveiled by the Taoiseach of Ireland. A dog born in that village had become important enough to the country that the head of government came to mark his memory. In 2007, a journalist named John Henderson compiled a list of the 100 greatest British sportsmen of all time for a book called Best of British. Mick the Miller was included. He was one of only 2 animals named on the entire list. The other was red rum. Over 90 years after his first race, Mick the Miller's name appears regularly on British quiz shows, in documentaries, in books about the golden age of sport between the wars. He is referenced whenever someone wants to describe an animal of superhuman competitive ability. His record stood for over 40 years. His back-to-back Derby victories were unmatched for more than 4 decades. The attendance figures he generated, the cultural moment he created, the newspaper coverage he commanded, all of it sat in a category of its own, belonging to a dog who had started his life as the runt of a litter in rural Ireland and finished it as the most famous animal in Britain. This is what his final record looked like. 51 wins, 68 races, 6 world records, 5 major classic titles, the first greyhound to win the English Derby twice, the oldest greyhound to ever win the St. Leger, 19 consecutive victories, a career that began with near-fatal illness, that was built by a country priest in a village most people had never heard of, that ended with 40,000 people on their feet at Wembley Stadium, watching an old dog win a race nobody believed he still had in him. Because sometimes the runt of the litter turns out to be the most extraordinary athlete anyone has ever seen. And sometimes a small dog from a small town, born at the bottom of the pile, raised by a man of faith who refused to give up on him, runs so fast and fights so hard and refuses so stubbornly to accept the limits everyone else places on him that the entire world stops to watch. Mick the Miller, the greatest racing dog who ever lived.